Alright, so we've got another video that again I've released on YouTube under the title of something like How My Friend Ranked First in Medical School, because a friend of mine, basically I gave a talk in my third year when he was in his first year of med school about active recall and spaced repetition. And so he took that idea and ran with that idea to its extreme and basically just wrote questions for himself. So if you haven't seen that video yet, I will include it in here just for completeness sake. But if you have seen the video, obviously there's no need to watch this video in the class. Yeah, again, this technique also combines active recall. It combines lack of taking notes. It combines a little bit of highlighting because he color-coded stuff in different ways. So hopefully you'll see how it applies the techniques that we've already talked about in this class, and maybe that'll work for you. And actually, this is the technique that I use to this day because I avoid trying to take too many notes. What I do instead is I write questions, and sometimes I won't even write the answers to those questions. I'll just write the questions themselves because I know that I can always look up the answer if I need to, and it's just a bit more efficient that way. So yeah, active recall framework coming up, and I'll see you at the end. Okay, so the method is as follows. Basically, instead of ever writing any notes, instead of ever trying to summarize content from lectures or textbooks, what my friend Asay did is that all he did was just to write a ton of questions for himself. And then when he was revising, he would just go over those questions over and over again. And after a handful, maybe like 3 or 4 repetitions of these questions, he pretty much knew everything in every subject inside out. So how does this work? Let's hop into the laptop, as they say, and I'll show you these were the documents that he made for each of the subjects. So we've got HOM, which is physiology, we've got MIMS, which is biochemistry, and we've got anatomy, which is anatomy. So let's start with HOM, which is physiology. So essentially, he's gone through the lecture notes and through a textbook alongside, and he's basically converted everything into questions. So the first lecture was about cell membranes and stuff. So his question is, what are some roles of the cell membrane? Then it was about control systems. When is ballistic control good and what's an example? Let's scroll down a bit to what's another topic? So we've got muscles as another topic. What does the size of a motor unit determine? What is the kinetic state diagram for this? Why is there a constant isometric force below 2.2 to 2.0 microns? Basically a ton of questions. So 60 questions for muscles. For cardiology, we've got, how many questions is this? Wow, this is a lot of questions, my God. This is how you rank first in medical school. Whoa, 216 questions for cardiology. He was a bit of a cardiology nerd, so he kind of fleshed out the lecture notes with some information from textbooks. But again, never made any notes from the textbooks. All he did was just write questions for himself. More stuff, respiratory questions from the lecture notes, 100 plus, 158, quick questions about the kidneys. And as you can see, he's basically got an entire like 37-page Google Doc / Word doc, literally just filled with questions. He hasn't wasted any time in making notes and in summarizing. All he's done is just write questions for himself. And the idea is that he's done this for every subject. And then when he's sitting down to study, he decides in advance or like on the day what subject he wants to study that day. So let's say he's doing, I don't know, anatomy, and he wants to revise the upper limb. Then what he's going to do, he's going to open up his upper limb document, and all he's going to do is he's going to go through the questions one by one and ask himself if he can feasibly answer those questions in his head. He doesn't really write anything down. He just sort of tries to answer them out loud or in his head. So how does the median cubital vein run? Oh God, I can't remember that at all. What do the lucidum cells contain and where are they found? No idea. I don't even know those are a thing. Which 2 layers make up the dermis? Ooh, I probably should know that, but I really can't remember. Anyway, this is essentially like all of the stuff for anatomy. Again, 34 pages of just questions. And that's basically it. The method is going through the lecture notes, going through textbooks, but like what we all like to do by default is we like to highlight and like make notes. For some reason, we think it's useful to summarize our lecture notes or summarize a textbook or summarize a revision guide. And then, I don't know, I think the theory is that we will read over our summaries and maybe highlight stuff and maybe ask ourselves questions, but this is a purely active recall based method. All he's literally doing is just asking questions and answering them. So let's move on to why this method works. And this whole method is based around the principle of active recall. I have been preaching about active recall for literally the last 2 years, and actually even longer than that, since before I got this YouTube channel, just like in talks and lectures and stuff that I would give. I'd be like, active recall is literally the best thing ever. It's the best thing ever because active recall is the single most efficient study technique that's ever been discovered. There is a mountain of evidence supporting it. I've got a 25-minute long video that I'll link in the video description and in a card up there somewhere where I go through the evidence in much more detail. But essentially what active recall means is testing yourself. And the reason testing ourselves is so amazingly valuable is because the way the brain works, it's all based around how many times and how much you retrieve information from your brain. So we all have this misconception that in order to study, we have to put stuff into our brains. But actually, it's flipped on its head if you look at the evidence. The actual way to remember anything and to make anything stick is by retrieving information from our brains rather than trying to put it back in. So let's say we read something once and we've understood a topic. At that point, the most effective thing we can do with our time is ask ourselves questions about that topic. And they've done loads of studies whereby they've taken a group of college students or high school students or whatever, and they split them up into different groups, and they'll teach all the groups exactly the same topic. But for one of the groups, they'll get them to reread it. For one of the groups, they'll get them to make a mind map. For one of the groups, they'll tell them to read it 4 times. For another group, they'll tell them to make notes. And for one of the groups, they'll just give them a test on the subject. And then if you look at the results afterwards, like when they get tested later, maybe a week later, you'll find that the people that get tested, the people who did the active recall, who actively tried to retrieve the information, rather than just reread it or make notes on it, those were the people that performed significantly better in their exams. And again, much more evidence in my legit evidence-based revision tips video. This is just kind of an introduction. So I don't think this can be stated enough. It's just the only, it's such a good revision technique to just test yourself on stuff that it still baffles me that despite even watching some of my videos, maybe reading a book called Make It Stick, really good book to how to effectively learn, or watching any of my friends Thomas Frank's videos, all of the evidence around study tips is basically that active recall is the way forward. And I'm waxing on about this for absolutely ages because, they say that on average it takes about 7 repetitions, 7 times hearing the same concept to really fully internalize it. And I think the more people in the world hear about active recall and kind of hear about the good news of active recall, the better human productivity as a whole would be, and the better our lives as students would be, because we'd have to spend less time studying and more time doing the things that actually matter to us. But yeah, that's basically how the method works. I'll stop droning on about this now. Let's now talk about the method in a bit more detail, and I'll show you how you can use various different apps to achieve this same effect. All right, so let's talk about this method in a bit more detail. And one of the common questions about this method is, what do you do if you don't know the answer to one of the questions that you've written? So at the start, we've gone through our lectures and we've just converted everything into just questions. We've gone through our textbook and we've just written questions for ourselves. But then when we're going through the questions, obviously there's going to be stuff that we don't remember the answer to. So for example, if I read, what is the capacitance of biomembranes? I might not remember that from the lecture notes. But the key thing of Asaid's method is that he never writes down the answer to these questions. He trusts that he'll be able to find the information in the lecture notes or in the textbook or on Google, and therefore he doesn't have to waste the time to actually write down the answer for all of these. And that's obviously a benefit because it means we save time and it's a bit more efficient. But obviously the drawback is that then when we're going through stuff, it does take a little bit of time to then find that information in the right place. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing that in order to get information, we have to go back to our lecture notes, because at least for us in Cambridge, the lecture notes are usually quite well structured and quite well organized. And so the act of finding information in a lecture notes means that we'll be able to see what section the information's in. We'll be like, oh, okay, that's the capacitance of biomembranes, and we'll see where it fits into the bigger picture. Equally, if we're having to go into a textbook, textbooks are usually very well written because, they've been around for years and they're written by clever people and stuff. And so if we're finding information in a textbook, again, we're going to be getting that information in the context of the rest of the subject. And then maybe instead of just reading about the capacitance of biomembranes, we'll read a little bit more about biomembranes and kind of just understand the subject a little bit better. And so what Asaid's doing is number one, the first pass through the lecture, he's just converting into questions. And then the second time he comes around to revise the subject, he's going to go through the questions, ask himself one by one. And then what he does is that he's color coding in red, for example, over here, the questions that he didn't know the answer to, so that the next time around, if he's short on time, he won't go through every single question. He'll just go through the questions that he's marked red. And then let's say the third time around, if there are questions that he didn't get in the second time, he'll mark them as blue. And then the third time around, he'll just go over the blue questions. So this becomes a very efficient way of only doing the questions that we know we got wrong previously. And obviously before the exam, and at some point, we want to be going through every single question, because one of the other concepts in effective studying is called spaced repetition. And again, I'll link my video about that down here and in a card up there, and you can check it out more. But basically the idea is that cramming is ineffective. It obviously works in the short term. We've all done cramming for exams. But actually, if we want information to stick over a very long-term period, we want to be repeating that information at spaced intervals to overcome what's called the forgetting effect, or the forgetting curve. That was discovered by a guy called Ebbinghaus in like the 1800s, I think. But yeah, more information in my spaced repetition video. Basically, it's all about active recall and spaced repetition, and this method really works in that sense. And we can see here, he's even color-coded some of them in purple, and I suspect those are the questions that he was a little bit struggling with on his fourth pass of doing these questions. This isn't the sort of method that you can just kind of do once and then forget about and then be like, oh, well, I haven't done any work for a year, therefore I'm going to cram this in 2 days before the exam. You probably could, but it would be cramming. It wouldn't be long-term knowledge that would stick. Whereas doing this and applying spaced repetition to it would really be magical. And I'll just show you how I would apply this method personally. So active recall is the best thing ever. So I've been using variants of this method for a few years now. I just haven't used them as well as Asaid has because I feel, I get lazy and I'm not great, but he is really good at kind of actually doing the work. Anyway, the other day I was preparing for a supervision where I'm teaching physiology, and so I was going through the heart and circulation lecture notes. And I was basically doing Asaid's method of going through them and writing out questions for myself. So again, here I'm using the app Notion, link below. I'll link to a few of my videos on that if you care. But I think Notion is really good because they've got this toggle feature, which means what I can do is I can, for example, if I go into fetal circulation, what I've done is I've written questions for myself. Why does the fetal circulation need to be special? What does the oxygen dissociation curve look like? Various adaptations, fetal shunts. I've written these questions for myself, but if I were Asaid, I would just write the questions and not the answer. But because at the moment, I'm not really in the market for just memorizing information, I've written the answer down to some of these as well, again, through a toggle box. So actually, I haven't written down the answer to that because this is kind of weird, but what I do is that for questions that I know the answer to, or that I know I can figure out the answer to, or I know I can find the answer easily in the lecture notes, or then I won't bother writing it down. So why does the fetal circulation need to be special? Clearly, that's because we need to overcome the problem that when you're a fetus, i.e. inside your mum, you don't have any lungs that work. Therefore, you need to get your oxygen from the mother's placental blood flow and all that stuff. Therefore, you need to be adapted, and your hemoglobin needs to be adapted, and your circulation needs to be adapted to try and get oxygen out of the mother's blood. And I know this. So I've written the question for myself, but I don't need to waste the time writing the answer because I know. And if I ever get to the point where I read that question and think, oh, I don't know what the answer is, then I will go back to the lecture notes. But I'm just trying to be efficient in minimizing the amount of information I'm having to put into my notes because, as we've said, and as all the evidence shows, summarizing information, taking notes with the book open is just not a very effective way of studying. Anyway, this one, what does the oxygen dissociation curve for hemoglobin look like comparing maternal versus fetal? I know what it looks like in my head, and so when I see that question, I'll be drawing it out in my head. Maybe I'll draw it out on paper if I feel like it. But crucially, I have actually included the oxygen dissociation curve in this toggle box. And this is very easy to do. So here is a screencast of myself making these notes because I'd screen recorded myself just in case I was going to make one of these videos. And you can see that on the left-hand side, I've got the lecture notes open, and on the right-hand side, I'm creating this document in Notion. And what I'm doing is that for a lot of the stuff, I'm just screen grabbing bits from the lecture notes. I'm not copying and pasting. I'm rarely writing it out myself. I'm just kind of using the screen grab shortcut on the Mac to select a particular area of the screen, shoving it into Notion, and then that makes it easier for me to find this graph when I need to see it. So yeah, I can immediately look at this graph now and think, okay, that's what I thought this dissociation curve for hemoglobin looked like, and then I can untoggle this and move on. What are the various adaptations of the fetal circulation? So number 1, 2, and 3. So these are stuff that I wrote down because in the lecture notes, this was in a few different sections. And so I just thought, you know what, I'm going to take 10 seconds to just type out what these answers are. But for example, if I looked at fetal hemoglobin relinquishes that oxygen at lower oxygen tensions, if that sentence didn't make sense to me, I wouldn't just take it at face value. I would obviously go back to the lecture notes or go back to my textbook and figure out what I'm struggling with, why this sentence doesn't make sense to me, and work out so try and understand what's going on. And this all comes back to it's all very well doing active recall, it's all very well doing spaced repetition and doing all of this stuff, but really the thing that trumps all of these things is to understand the content. There is literally no point in just memorizing facts if we don't understand the broad principles that underlie them. And so as I'm going through these questions, as any of my friends who do effective studying, as we're going through our questions, we're trying to understand the topic. And if we ever get to a point where we're like, oh, I'm not quite sure what that means, we will take the time to look it up because especially with effective learning, there's this misconception that learning should be easy, that, the best way to learn is by finding a really condensed set of notes and just reading it and getting that information into our heads. But again, it's sort of the other way around. It's the more effortful, the more hard it feels to be learning something, the more we're actually going to be learning it. And there's, again, so much evidence where people have done studies on students where they rate how hard they found the subject and how hard it was to learn about it. And you find that those students perform better on the exam and learn more consistently and have that knowledge for a longer period of time. Because as we're grappling with stuff, as we're putting effort into learning, our brain is forming these connections. And the way I think of it is sort of like going to the gym. And it's like, you know, if I can bench press 80 kilograms, I can't, I wish. I can probably bench press about 70 kilograms. But, you know, when I bench 70 kilograms, that is effortful. That is when my muscles are going to grow. Whereas when I bench 20 kilograms, then, you know, basically nothing's going to happen because it's easy. So it's kind of the same with studying. Like when it's difficult, we are actively forming connections in our brain, and then we sleep, and then those connections get solidified. When it feels easy, when we're just like, oh yeah, reading and highlighting and making notes is really easy. That's why we love doing it, because it feels really productive. We kind of go through pretty colors and we write down stuff, but we're not actually using our brains. And the more we use our brains, the more effortful learning is, the more information is going to stick. Anyway, next one, what are fetal shunts and what do they do? Again, I kind of wrote some brief notes here, you know, Freeman and Varley, RA to LA, because fetal lungs don't work. And this information makes perfect sense to me. But for example, if you were a first year medical student studying this for the first time and looking at my notes, you'd see RA to LA because fetal lungs don't work. Like, what the hell does that mean? You know, it's a sort of information that requires more context. And note taking, again, I'm gonna make a video about this, is sort of a balance of compression versus context. Textbooks and lecture notes have a lot of context. They're very long, very broad, but they give you the context, they help you understand the topic. Whereas when we take notes, we have compressed all that information down. And so when I see RA to LA because fetal lungs don't work, I know immediately exactly what that means. I could explain it to a 5-year-old if I wanted to. But if a first year medic who had never done the subject before were to see that, they wouldn't understand it. And so that would be a case of going into the textbook and actually understanding what's going on, coming back to this idea of understanding. And then I've just kind of done this for all of the stuff within cardiology so far. So cardiac cycle, I've written about the phases, intrinsic regulation. What were Frank and Starling's famous experiments? So at this point, I'd read the question, I'd think, okay, something about a dog heart preparation. And then, yeah, experiment 1, increased preload. Experiment 2, there should be something there. But yeah, I've just literally screen grabbed stuff from the lecture notes and a diagram just to save me a little bit of time. But I think if I were actually studying the subject, if I were actually taking exams, I probably wouldn't even write down the answer. I'd force myself to go into the lecture notes or go into the textbook and find the answer. So, long story short, basically, this is Asaid's magical method for active recall. And the reason he actually came about this method was that in 2015, I gave a talk at the university about how to study for exams. Because in 2015, I was studying psychology for my 3rd year, and I'd been actively looking into all of this evidence-based study tips and all that stuff. And initially I was supposed to be giving a talk at the Islamic Society prayer room for like 5 people because no one turns up. But we made a Facebook event of it, and suddenly like people started sharing it amongst other members of the university. And then I think at the end of it, like 20,000 people had viewed that event according to the analytics instead of like 7. And like 100 and something people turned up to the event. And so we had to kind of like expand the venue and kind of do it in one of the colleges. But in this talk, I basically talked about the magic of active recall, the magic of spaced repetition. And when my friend Asaid heard that, he was like, all right, we're done. And from that point onwards, like for the next 2 months, all he did was create these questions for himself. And the cool thing is that he didn't do that much anal work for the rest of the year. That sounds weird. He kind of kept up with his essays, and he kind of understood the subject and read a few textbooks and the lecture notes just to keep on top of things. But it was only 2 months before the exam in the Easter term that he discovered this magic of active recall and spent the rest of the 2 months making these questions and answering them. And so if he were to have started that method from day 1, I suspect, and wanted to put in the effort over a very long-term period of time for the whole year, I suspect that would have been even more efficient, and he would have even spent even less time studying. Anyway, yeah, this has been a very long, very rambly video, basically explaining this concept of, if you want to do really well in your exams, it's really all about testing yourself. And this is sort of testing yourself. This is the concept of active recall taken to its logical extreme, where you're not spending any time at all writing notes, because that's a waste of time. You're spending 100% of your time writing questions for yourself and then answering those questions, dredging up the information from our brains, and then sort of solidifying those connections. So thank you so much for watching. All right, so that was the active recall framework. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.